Hello, everyone, and welcome to the good stuff. We're going to cover the psychology of working framework and theory. The research article that we read was by Dr. Otten and Dr. Duffy, and this presentation is brought to you by Austin, Adam, myself, and Emily. So without further ado, let's get right into it, as there is a lot to cover. So to start off, what is the difference between the theory and the framework? Well, a theory is a system of ideas that attempts to explain or predict relationships between or among phenomena. The framework takes keywords, key concepts, they select them, evaluate them, and compare them to explain the theory. It's basically the logical master plan of the structure that is going to explain that theory. This is the framework that was developed for the psychology of work theory. It is a bit complicated. Don't get overwhelmed. What I want you to think about right now is we'll be covering this throughout the presentation. I want you to start off by thinking of it as decent work as being the central component. And predictors, the moderator variables, the mediator variables, they all feed into the decent work, which is that central component. And outcomes are the result. Now, outcomes can also be separated as predictors, moderator variables, and mediator variables. They can all be separated into subcategories. And those subcategories we'll talk about in more detail in just a second. But right now, before we go any further, I want to introduce Dr. David Blustein to give us a little more on the psychology of work theory and framework. So grab a pen, piece of paper, or your laptop, and let's listen to some David Blustein.
Psychology of working is a perspective that a few colleagues and I have been thinking about for a number of years. It's a way to include everybody in how we think about work. You see, psychologists, counselors, and many other social and behavioral scientists have typically focused on the work lives of people who have choice, who can make their own decisions about what they do, which is a great aspect of modern life. But the reality is most people around the globe do not have choice in what they do. They basically take what they can get. That's the case for the majority of workers around the globe. And what I felt like I needed to do was to really chart a direction for psychologists, mental health workers, mental health therapists, and also educators, social scientists, behavioral scientists, to think about work in a broader, more inclusive way. So it also looks at the impact that work has on our personal lives, the impact of work in psychotherapy and in counseling, which hasn't been dealt with that well. So I really tried to articulate a kind of inclusive, broad-ranging perspective. The reality is there have been a number of people thinking about this, people who've been looking at the work lives of people of color, of the poor, of immigrants, counselors and psychologists who are looking at the work lives of everybody who works, have all come to a similar conclusion, that we don't really have a way of thinking about or understanding work as most people do it, as most people experience it. Even in a privileged country like the US, where of course we have pockets of poverty, but for the people here who do have privilege, recent research has demonstrated that most people would do things differently in their work lives. So people often get stuck in careers that they're forced to stay in because of economic reasons or family reasons. So I think the issue of choice, you're right, it really flows along a continuum. It's not like you either have choice or you don't have choice. So I think this is relevant for even the people who work, who have had a fair amount of education and access to opportunity. Work impacts people's lives in a multiple set of ways. First off, having work allows us to survive. It gives us the means to continue our existence. Food, shelter, money, things that we could exchange for other goods and services. Work also provides us with a way of having social connections and relationships. And increasingly, that's an aspect of work that people are talking and writing more and more about. The work is really a place where we find ourselves feeling connected. And psychologists over the last 20 or 30 years have increasingly observed that we really are hardwired for social connection and for relationships. And the third thing is I think work does provide us with a way of self-determining our own future, of kind of trying to articulate what we want to do. Work, in many ways, is like what play is for children. I think human beings are constructed to do something with themselves. You know, when we were kids, we used to build little sand castles or play with blocks and build little cities. In work, we do different things, all sorts of different things, and it gives us a sense of meaning and accomplishment, as well as a sense of identity. But I think there's a natural striving for people to work, much as there's a natural striving to be curious about the world. Work in of itself, I think, is something that does give people a sense of dignity. I think that there is something inherently positive about many forms of work. There are many forms of work, however, that are denigrating, that are laborious, that are physically taxing, that can even be painful or oppressive. But I think if the environmental supports are there, if people are feeling nurtured and supported and have the skills in the area where they're working, I think work can be noble. In my own personal life, my parents, neither of them had what they call glamorous jobs, but they felt very much connected to the world by being able to work. And they felt a sense of wholeness about it. Psychotherapists have not really dealt with work well. If you look at most of the psychotherapy theories, you know, classic Freudian theories that people know about, you know, through reading, through the media, there's almost no mention of work at all. And this is the case currently as well. So the reality is that people come into therapists' offices talking about work problems, but therapists don't really have a language or a set of tools to use. We are very much trained as therapists to deal with family issues, to deal with intrapsychic or internal conflicts or irrational beliefs or emotions that we're having trouble regulating. But therapists aren't really trained to really understand much about the context people live in. I also think that therapists have unconsciously colluded to not deal with work, and by doing so they're also able to avoid, in some ways, what is the most vivid example of lack of equity in the world, that not everybody has the same access to opportunity. And I believe that when therapists increasingly look at work as a viable point, as a viable issue in their work, in their treatment, I think that the quality of therapy will improve dramatically. And if there's anything that I try to do was to convey, was to speak for those who haven't had a chance to speak, to speak for those who haven't had a chance to have their place at the public policy table, and was really to try to push that agenda that we need to attend to everybody who works, not just the white-collar person who could pay the high consulting fees or high therapy fees.
Thanks, Doc, for that level of insight. So as you heard in that video, there's a need for PWF. As of now, there's a lot of research that talks about exactly what Blustein is saying, where the research today, the current literature, it studies individuals with that high level of freedom of work choice. It looks at a lot of white collar jobs or people that have opportunities. It assumes individuals have the volition to pursue jobs that align well with their personality and skill sets. But recently there has been a shift in perspective as we see more marginalized populations being left behind. And it's about, now we're shifting it towards looking at the contextual and structural factors and how these affect vocational choices. So some things that PWF assumes is that decent work is essential in the satisfaction of basic human needs that support work fulfillment and well-being. Is what helps people feel satisfied at work, fulfilled in relationships, social connections, and just feeling value in their life, as it's an expression of them, it's an extension, work is. So it's important to understand the underlying mechanisms that are social, economic, political, and other historical forces shaping the lives of individuals. As we take you through this journey of the research, I want you to keep in mind, how could this theoretical framework help you as a helping professional address career choice limitations, access to opportunity, social connections / supports, and also how integrating it in mental health issues. So without further ado, I will hand it off to Adam. Adam, take it away.
The first two predictor variables that are proposed to affect access to decent work are economic constraints and marginalization. Economic constraints limits one's access and generally socially excludes one from resources such as education, public resources, vocational development resources, and prevents one from gaining resources that allow for a higher degree of choice in one's vocation, such as access to higher education. It's closely linked to social class. Second, marginalization, which is kind of interacts with economic constraints. So the second primary predictor is defined as the relegation of people or groups of people to a less powerful or less included position within a society. This is based on the intersections of one's identity. And because of these unique intersections, each person's experience is unique with this. And this second predictor works to keep minoritized groups from both equal access to decent work and for opportunities to development once in the workplace. And this is not just like physical barriers, but also kind of psychological barriers like lack of mentorship and navigating a system, or feelings of alienation or lack of belongingness. These are also barriers. Related to these predictor variables are mediator variables, which are kind of the proposed mechanisms for why economic constraints and marginalization have the effect that they do on access to decent work. So the first is work volition. So it's proposed that this is the perceived freedom of work options, of work choice despite barriers. And while this perception is different for each individual, it's proposed that generally as experiences of marginalization and greater economic constraints goes up, folks will have less work volition left and will perceive less freedom of choices. Also is career adaptability, one's capacity to use resources to cope with current and anticipated vocational tasks. Again, this is related to one's individual experience. If we saw someone else who shares a similar identity, working through and coping with these barriers successfully, maybe one might have greater career adaptability. So this is an individual level kind of perception or change, and yet it is also linked with those first two variables. This includes concern, control, curiosity, and confidence in related to one's vocational development. Moderator variables are proposed ways that this pattern can be changed, or these effects can be changed. So economic climate on the bottom is one thing that affects access to decent work, as well as the top three in green: proactive personality, social support, and critical consciousness. The top three are highlighted because these have been identified as being more malleable and more in an individual's control than economic climate, and are more ripe to be used as a point of intervention. And these top three have been found in research to be correlated with more positive vocational outcomes and behaviors and actions and attitudes that correlate with more positive access to decent work.
All right, thank you, Adam. So it's my turn now. I'll be talking about decent work, which is the central variable in the psychology of working theory. In the article that we read, they actually describe decent work as essential in the satisfaction of basic human needs that support work fulfillment and well-being. So what is decent work? The criteria for decent work was based on the International Labor Organization standards in the article that we read, and this consists of 5 different standards. So the first one is physically and interpersonally safe working conditions. So obviously this would include absence of physical, mental, or emotional abuse. In the video that Devin showed us earlier, David Blustein talks about how this is called the relational environment. And I think we can all attest to how important this is to a work environment. Oftentimes we hear people say, oh, I like my coworkers though. And they're like, oh, good, that's the most important thing. So the people who you work with and the setting is extremely important in finding decent work. Another criteria is having hours that allow for free time and adequate rest. So we all know that if you work straight for 8 hours without taking any kind of break, you're not going to be as productive or efficient by the end of the day, and you'll get burnt out. So it's very important to take breaks for ourselves and to have time to rest and recover and give our brains a break, because mentally and physically, like, we need rest during our workday. So that's also a critical component to decent work. Another one is organizational values that complement family and social values. So this is huge for us as counselors. The whole idea of like reflecting meaning is fundamental to this. Finding people's values, their passions, what they love doing. That's so crucial in finding that in a work environment. And if you can't find it in a work environment, is it somewhere in your life? Are you manifesting those values through your interests or your hobbies, something outside of work? And if you don't have it in your work life and you want it in your work life, then maybe we need to consider how we could change your role within the organization or find employment at a different organization. The fourth criteria is adequate compensation. So obviously this is extremely important. In our world, in our economy, you need money to live. And the last one is access to adequate healthcare. So understandably also extremely important for our mental, emotional, physical health. And so all these things are a lot, which this theory recognizes. This theory says that it's very hard to secure all these things. And I wonder, as you know, counselors soon to be who we have jobs and we have internships, do you guys feel like you are finding all of these things in your positions? And if not, what could you do to find them? And as counselors, that's why it's so important for us to recognize the variables that Adam described earlier and advocate for a client so they can have those variables, which can lead to decent work. And then there's outcomes of decent work. So now we're talking about the right side of the model. These are the three basic human needs. So survival and power needs, obviously, like you need food, water, shelter, clothing, social capital, and education. Also social connection needs, so a sense of belonging within one's community. Again, are you finding that in your work environment, or are you finding that outside of your work environment? How do you want to manifest that sense of belonging in your life, using those life design conversations? And then also self-determination needs. So in our article, it went a bit in depth about self-determination theory by Ryan and Deci. And this theory explains that all of the jobs that we have in our life will have some tasks that we don't enjoy. As counselors, I know for some of us, that's taking notes at the end of the day, especially if we've had a long day full of clients, like taking those notes can be really difficult. So we're not intrinsically motivated to do it. But if we have extrinsic motivation, maybe to earn an LPC, that can make us more self-determined to complete those notes and to complete those tasks that aren't as enjoyable or fulfilling for us. There are two other outcomes as well that are related to need satisfaction. So work fulfillment. So if you have decent work, if you have all those 5 criteria that I mentioned earlier, you'll have more satisfaction in your job, you'll find more meaning in your work, and you'll be more engaged, which helps you as an individual and also helps the organization as a whole, because those feelings can bleed into other people and surroundings and inspire them as well. And then of course, having decent work is related to general well-being. So overall satisfaction with life, physical and psychological health. It probably goes without saying that research has shown that these two are very highly related. In other words, people who are more satisfied with their life are more satisfied with their work. And that relationship works vice versa in both directions. So with all that being said and shared, I'm going to show the psychology of working theory model. That's a mouthful again. So we can see the predictor variables and the moderator variables that Adam talked about, how decent work is right smack dab in the middle of this model, extremely fundamental to it. And then the outcomes that I addressed. So those 3 basic needs: survival needs, social connection, self-determination, and then fulfillment at work and well-being, which are always linked to each other. And that's why it's so important to keep career in mind when counseling with clients. And on that note, I will pass it over.
Hello, everyone. This is Austin. I'll be taking over from here. So now we're going to talk about applying the psychology of working framework to more of actual sort of application of what you can be doing with clients. Just more of like a day-to-day of actually taking the theory and the theoretical background and applying it to working with clients. So really, the PWT stresses an overall holistic approach. It's taking in the context of the clients, their environmental factors, the things that are around them that maybe they have some control over or no control over, but really just taking all those things into account. So the main thing from the PWT when thinking about working with clients is just taking an overall holistic approach to their development as it applies to their career. So it's not just the career goals they have or some of the career aspirations or whether they're working on transitions or anything like that. It's all the other sort of context and environmental factors that are happening at the same time for those clients. So what does this mean for your work with clients? I pulled this quote from the article because I thought it was just an overall really good representation of kind of what the PWT is saying and the framework is working towards when applying it with clients. And it says, counselors are encouraged to conceptualize work as an essential aspect of physical and psychological well-being. So it's not just the work that the clients are doing or the work that they want to be doing. It's sort of the whole picture of what's going into it and sort of creating an identity and well-being for both their life in and outside of work. It does have some empirical supports that you can work with clients, and the ones that it provides are social support, critical consciousness, and proactive personality. So those are some of the things that the model and the framework stresses as sort of empirical things that you can really work on with clients. Now we're going to talk about advocacy through policies. So part of the article talks about ways that we as career counselors and counselors in general can really act as advocates. The article talks about how career counselors in particular, sometimes in certain settings, they're not seen as advocates, and really they should be. So once again, I pulled this quote because I thought it was a good representation of what the article was trying to say. So it says, career counseling professionals should allow narratives of workers from disenfranchised groups to guide research, theory, and intervention. And I thought that was pretty powerful, just thinking about the fact that working with certain clients that may come from disenfranchised backgrounds or oppressed backgrounds or marginalized groups, really letting their stories and their ability or inability to enter the workforce or career or anything like that, let that guide kind of what we're doing and how we're doing it, and let that guide the different decisions that we make, on an individual level, on a systems level, and all that kind of thing. And that's kind of what it talks about later. And these points that I have is system level intervention. So not just trying to work one-on-one with the client and making sure that they have equal access to different careers and workplaces and stuff, but really kind of working on that systems level and making sure that, all clients and all people who could come into your office have those opportunities. An example that they use is maybe like school-based interventions promoting education and access for all students that promote equity in work. So example of that, what I was thinking is like maybe creating a STEM group in a middle school that really, tries to get girls and female identifying students to come to the group to expose them to the STEM fields that maybe they feel sometimes they're discouraged from pursuing, or creating like a business leadership group that really targets minority students to make sure that those opportunities are also available to them. So really for me, it's just making sure that all opportunities of work are available for all people, and not sort of like taking them out of any opportunities that they might want just because of their gender or their race or their ethnicity, their economic background, anything like that. Just making sure all opportunities are open to all people. The next thing is to engage in advocacy and discussion at legislative and policy levels. So the article talks about the fact that as career counselors and as counselors in general, we need to be having discussions at these levels so that we can change policies and we can change legislation that benefit clients from marginalized backgrounds. All right, so now we're going to talk about how the PWT kind of moves into the future and some things that still need to be worked out and applied in research to make it better. So the first thing is to adapt the PWT to specific populations. So the PWT does take into effect people's different identities and stuff, but how does it actually apply to specific populations? So it says identify mediators and moderators that might be specific or different for various populations. The next one is this model and framework was developed primarily based off of the United States population of samples of people from the United States. And so the next step is to identify how the PWT applies to a population outside of the US. And it also presupposes and it integrates this idea of self-determination, which is a pretty Western ideal, this sort of individualistic idea of self-determination. So how does it apply to maybe more collectivist cultures and cultures that don't subscribe to that sort of ideal? And then also, how does PWT sort of transform and give identity over the lifespan? I pulled this quote. It says, it will be important to understand how access to decent work might promote physical and emotional well-being as adults age, including after retirement. So not just applying the PWTs to sort of specific situations and interventions, but how does it really adapt over a client's entire lifespan? And then the last thing I'd mention is just like continuing cross collaboration for career professionals in different areas. All right, this is final one. We have these recap questions. So if you would kind of read through them and take your own time to answer them, we'd really appreciate that. So the first one is, how would you summarize the PWT framework and model to someone who has never heard of it, maybe to a client if they want to understand it? The next one is, what do you see as the benefits of this framework, and how about the cons as well? Third one is, what are some specific questions, reflections, etc. You might use with clients when implementing this framework? So what would you actually be saying to a client to implement this framework? And the last one is, how might you integrate the PWT into your specific specializations or your unique work with clients? So thank you guys for coming to or watching this presentation. We appreciate it. If you want to kind of take time and reflect on these questions. And then we also have the references there. We used the article that was assigned, and then Adam also brought up this book, The Importance of Work in an Age of Uncertainty by Blustein, if you guys want to look it up as well. So thank you. We appreciate it. Have a great day.